So, good morning and welcome to this roundtable discussion on reimagining the ICC performance code. I've sent out some background information. My name is Brian Meacham. I'm coordinating this research effort and leading it for the ICC. Just a little bit of background, the research effort is aimed at trying to understand kind of current perspectives on performance-based design and performance-based codes, see where different disciplines have advanced, and see if we can reimagine what the performance code would look like in such a way that it could be more broadly used and operate in a more holistic manner. And I think, as some of the motivations are that, the original version didn't really include some key areas like sustainability and resilience, didn't have a lot on energy and other areas that, grew much more prominent in performance in the intervening years. Structural engineering and views on resilience have advanced, and it just seems like good timing to look at this and say, if we're going to redo this, or if ICC decides to redo this, what should it look like, what people are thinking, and where do we go from here? So I've been doing these roundtable discussions with different groups: structural engineers, resilience people, fire protection, MEP, energy people, some building facilities people, coming up with building officials and fire officials, and of course today with architects. So what I'm aim to do really is I'm here to listen, ask a few questions, but I'm really trying to find out, what you think as architects need to be done. How do you think the market is set up to work? What needs to be done and changed to really make a robust and what I would hope for top level performance code for use in the US. And with that, I'd like to kind of go around the room and ask you to introduce yourself and give a brief overview of who you are, who you work for, why you're here, because this will be posted for others to see, and I think it's helpful if people understand who's participating and what perspectives it come from. So I'll go around the room based on who I see, and apologies in advance if I mangle any names. I'll start with Dave Collins.
Thanks, Brian. I'm Dave Collins. I'm an architect in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been practicing in codes for almost 50 years. And I've been serving the American Institute of Architects as a consultant for the past 21 years. And I was proud to be involved with Brian and the technical committee that put together the performance code. Been very disappointed to see that it has been left by the wayside over the years and very little, if anything, done to improve it for use by architects. Part of this has evolved from what the Blue Ribbon Panel did for AIA a few years back now. And during the discussions, there was a lot of information brought to the group about the need for tools for architects to address issues of design and health safety features in buildings that they were working on, that they couldn't get past the fundamental prescriptive requirements within the code with any effective tools to influence or to work collectively with the building officials to resolve the design issues in an effective and appropriate way. And it immediately came to my mind that the performance code was built there to do that, to become that tool that an architect, engineer, whatever, was involved in an issue that ran smack dab against the prescriptive criteria within the model building codes. and give us an opportunity to examine why those criteria are the way they are and what perhaps alternatives were better suited to solving the problem. So that's a little bit of background.
Thank you. Bill.
Aloha, I'm Bill Breezy, architect with Architects Hawaii, or now known as AHL. Had to change the name to attract the younger generation. So anyway, I've been involved with codes since the early 80s when I kept going down to the jurisdiction at the city of Tucson and Pima County and was complaining about the code isn't black and white. You know, there's all kinds of gray areas, and I was bugging him so often they put me on the building code committees. And when I relocated to Honolulu, I got involved with the AIA again and chaired their AIA codes committee for 9 years, and then I was appointed to a task force. Senate task force to create a state building code in Hawaii. And we finally got that through after 3 years. And I served as a member of the State Building Code Council for Hawaii for 6 years. So I'm, been doing this for a while and just want to, make it easier for architects to be able to understand the code. And I think the performance code gives us that opportunity. It gives us a tool that we can use for the building official to go in there and say, listen, granted the building code says this, but the performance code can, have alternate means and methods to comply, so it makes our job a little easier in convincing the AHJ of any of those issues that might come up.
Thank you. Chris.
I'm Chris Schwedick. I'm Illinois licensed architect and the chief code consultant at Burnham Nationwide and the director of the Code Group, which is a Illinois licensed architecture firm. I've had over 40 years of experience in the field, but it's really only in the last 20 some plus years that I've been involved in building codes. It's probably longer than that though, because being an architect in Chicago means that we were dealing with a code that was relatively ancient. I mean, it wasn't written on stone and hieroglyphs, but it was pretty darn old. And the way in which I got involved first really was because of a change in leadership at the city, where all of a sudden a attorney was made the building commissioner and didn't like the way certain things were being done, and threw the permit process into some havoc where contractors were very concerned about the way in which permits were being delayed because of code-related issues that they weren't really capable of addressing. So yeah, and that all evolved into finally, Chicago being the last holdout in terms of major cities who actually got into the process of adopting the ICC codes. So, and we're still under that process, although we've made major strides. So I've also been an adjunct faculty member of Harbor College in Palatine, where I teach a course in building codes, and I've been an active member of AIA really since the 80s. I've been on the boards of the AIA Illinois and AIA Chicago and the AIA Chicago Foundation, and was the 2018 chair of the AIA Codes and Standards Committee and was involved in that white paper that Dave mentioned, and very very enthused about the process of getting a better performance-based code. I've been also involved in ICC lately on some of the code committees, and one of the things we've been looking at is a rewrite really of some of the information in the in chapter 1 there under section 104, dealing specifically with alternative means. So this is definitely a hot topic and something that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Annika.
Hi, thanks. So I've been on the DC Energy Code Technical Advisory Group or Development Committee for, I'm on my 3rd cycle. We, in the last cycle, developed an Appendix Z for zero energy compliance as an alternative compliance path. Right now we're going through electrification, and we're in the process in DC of passing legislation for a mandatory zero code for new construction. The legislation would require this to be passed by 2026. I am also appointed to the Building Energy Performance Standard Task Force, which essentially is a performance standard for all existing buildings. Once you get your C of O, every building is then in the building performance standard compliance under that legislation. I was on the ICC 2021 Development Committee, Commercial, served on codes and standards for 3 years and chair my final year on the Blue Ribbon panel, which developed recommendations, including a recommendation for updating and developing the performance code, and testified before Congress, making recommendations about adoption of things like performance-based codes, outcome-based codes, and performance standards, really looking at accountability in building performance and sort of life cycle outcome-based requirements, both because I think it's important to our overall resiliency and carbon goals, and because it may really address some of the changing workforce issues and challenges we have with code enforcement if we really focus on performance and not sort of the prescriptive issues that we have in the past. And we might be able to update our standards more frequently if we aren't updating a prescriptive manual each time. I think that's pretty much the high level important stuff. So there you go.
Thank you. Drake.
Hi, I've been a registered architect, DC registered architect since 1989. And I pretty much practice architecture as a technical architect. And I've been involved in over more than 50% of the projects that are in place or design build since 1981. So I've always been looking for new solutions to the way things are done so that they can be done more effectively. I've been involved with the AIA National since 2010, and I've been quite involved with the building performance knowledge community, as well as have been an advocate for transformation to architectural education in North America.
Thank you. Ron.
I'm Ron Garan, the owner of RLGA Technical Services, which is, you see it. I'm an independent specifier and building code consultant. I also teach codes, among other things, at the School of Architecture, founded by Frank Lloyd Wright, formerly at Taliesin. And I'm also a former board chair of the Construction Specifications Institute. Was there, and I'm still actively involved. I'm actually a contract staff member now. I'm also was involved in the AIA Codes and Standards Committee, and I'm currently chairing the AWG Architectural Work Group for the Performance Code. We did a lot of modifications, if you call 8 a lot, but for there were significant changes to the performance code in the Group A cycle, and we're currently working on several changes for the Group B cycle. Other than that, that pretty much, if you're interested, I'm also an author of a book called Applying the Building Code, Step-by-Step Guidance for Building Design Professionals, and been in codes not quite as long as some of the other folks here. Been in it for about a little over 30 years, more heavily in the past 20 years. But it is a passion of mine, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can make this code more streamlined in the adoption process and the use by architects. Just a little side here, just to kind of get an understanding of why I'm looking at this, is I'm just reviewing a project where they've got a common paths situation that's 102 feet. They got a sprinkler system, Group B, 2 feet. Does that really make a difference over 100 feet? And so, you know, there's got to be some ways of getting around that.
Great, thank you. Ryan.
Morning, I'm Ryan Taylor. I'm an architect. I started practicing in the 90s in commercial work, and in 2002 founded my own company to focus on residential work. So I'm now an architect, a HERS rater, an HVAC designer, and I guess the takeaway there is that pretty much all the work that we do is mostly performance-based. There's not a lot of prescriptive work that we do on that side. I've had the great pleasure of serving on the National Codes and Standards Committee and serving on the Blue Ribbon panel as well. I'm in my 10th year, so the middle of my third term as the appointed representative for Georgia's architects on our statewide building code committee. We adopt and amend on a statewide basis. So even though I'm in residential, I try and stay abreast of all the commercial issues as well. So one of the things that I hope to share with you is just our experience in trying to move the building officials into the international existing building code, which they regard as a performance code, and we've had some pushback there. So hopefully I can offer some insight. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark.
Yes, hi, Mark Paraplitza. I'm an architect at Sarah Architects in Portland, Oregon, and I'm director of sustainability. So I'm coming at this kind of from we do a lot of projects that do voluntary standards, to address performance, and that's fine for those projects, but this really is performance sort of widespread and needs to be more broadly applied. And so this is a really important trend, including the energy codes. Just interested in participating in this process.
Thank you. Joe. Unmute.
Joe. Chell Anderson. I am an architect with LMN in Seattle. I'm on the State Building Code Council for Washington, where we have a 70% energy use reduction mandate by 2030, and we're most of the way there, or much of the way there. I chair the Energy Code Technical Advisory Group for commercial and residential for Washington State, and we've got basically almost all space heating and water heating will be heat pump based if the code that is out for public comment right now passes. There will be some exceptions, of course, but it also gets rid of electric resistance as well as fossil fuels, because both are not the path to get to 2030. So yeah, I'm on the AIA Committee on the Environment at the national level as well. And in 2012 or so, I did a year-long study with AIA Seattle on outcome-based codes, and came out, I went in strongly for, and I came out strongly against. And I would say I'm strongly against outcome-based codes, except in very, very limited circumstances. I don't think it's the right thing to do. To preview what I'm going to say, we have 8 years before 2030. We don't have time, I don't think, to build up the infrastructure at the permit offices to handle outcome-based codes. There might be other options, and I think there are a few. And then the existing buildings, has already been mentioned, we have ASHRAE 100, which is the law in Washington for buildings over 50,000 square feet. And that has some serious flaws in it, but that might be the way to do an outcome-ish based performance standard. Anyway, that's a brief introduction.
Thank you. Joe.
Now that I figured out technology, I can talk to you about myself. So I'm Joe Jerkowitz. I'm an architect with Kaler Slater in Milwaukee. I've been licensed since 1980 and have kind of been involved in the business since 1973. I've kind of always focused my career on technical code related things. So it is very natural for me to deal with code issues. I've had the opportunity to serve on the state of Wisconsin's Commercial Building Council, much like I think Ryan's experience, where the state of Wisconsin adopts a statewide building code. And I came on the committee immediately after they adopted the International Building Code. Prior to 2001, Wisconsin had always written their own code. So I didn't get to participate in a lot of the drama that occurred in terms of adopting the international code. I'm on right after that. Served for 9 or 10 years and still keep my hand in, kind of ad hoc with the Code Council at the state of Wisconsin. They had some administration changes. They rejiggered the whole Code Council and had it very heavily contractor based. But I've been fortunate to serve on AIA's National Codes and Standards Committee for the last couple of years. This coming year will be my 3rd year. And I'm, like I said, I'm very interested in codes. I think, a lot of me feels the same way that Gel does in terms of, I think it's going to be, to me, it's a hard sell. I'm trying to convince, I think, as I've thought about it, at least, municipalities or AHJs to accept that code, that approach. I don't think it's insurmountable by any means, but I like it because it's another arrow in our quiver. And I think as we move forward into the new world and we hit 2030 and everything, we need all the options we can in order to produce, quality buildings that perform properly, are friends to the environment. So.
Thank you. Gary. Gary Dempster. Okay, we'll try Andrew. Andrew. Okay, we'll go to Paul then.
And I'll be brief. I'll just say, I've been managing the AIA Codes Advocacy Program here in DC for about 7.5 years. And I know most of you through your work through the Codes and Standards Committee and or the Blue Ribbon Panel. And I'll say, first off, thank you for everyone being here and participating and giving your 2 cents. It's been an interesting road the last 18 or so months from when our Codes and Standards Committee first kind of gave a real first crack at this when Brian actually participated in a workshop that we held for our Codes and Standards Committee right as the pandemic started in April of 2020. But that spurred a lot of work, largely led by Ron Garan here to develop those code change proposals for the ICCPC. And then when we were approached earlier this year from Brian and others at ICC about this opportunity, we thought it was very interesting. And we wanted to make the connections to see what could come of it. So again, thanks to everybody for being here and looking forward to what comes from both the roundtable today and then the all stakeholder workshop to be scheduled later for the early part of the new year. So thanks for having us, Brian.
Thank you. And thank you all for your perspectives. I think I hear a lot of support for performance, so I don't think I have to ask if there's support in that area. I've heard some of the challenges that you perceive and have run into. So I think I'd like to explore that area a little bit more, kind of what do you see as, challenges to why the existing, performance code isn't used, what might be missing, from that is making things difficult, and what do you see as kind of basic requirements to be in the code to be more usable and adoptable. So I'll open it up with those kind of three small questions and try to get some perspectives on that.
Just taking a big step back, when you say performance, you're not talking about total building performance, you're talking about outcome-based codes, right? Where performance is measured by somebody after the building has been in operation for a certain amount of time, and then penalties or something like that. It happens if performance targets are not met. That's what you mean generally, right?
Well, that's a good question, because that's one of the things that has to be decided. So the way the original performance code, the ICCPC, is structured, it's really a compliance-based performance code, which aims to identify for people objectives that they should meet and demonstrate how the building will perform at the time it's constructed. And nobody really built into that outcomes that have to be demonstrated in the future. And my discussion with the energy folks, has paralleled a little bit some of the discussion here of the outcome-based code, to a performance strategy. So you have performance for compliance and, outcome performance measured over time. So I think it's completely on the table which approach or what combination is appropriate. And, I might add to that in talking to the structural engineers and in the resilience community, outcome-based, or being able to demonstrate that the performance you expect at a time of an event is not all that different to some of the outcome-based performance, I think, that is going forward on the energy side. So that would be one of the big issues to be tackled if a new activity would go forward.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that the existing performance code hasn't been adopted because it was outdated, and the initial effort was to update the performance code, and that performance code was focused on modeled performance or anticipated or predicted performance. But I think it does open the door for more of an outcome-based pathway that does look at least a certain period of time post-delivery, whether that's 1 or 2 years or just in perpetuity, the entire building's lifespan, and looking at more performance standard that we see in a few jurisdictions around the country, which is important if we're going to meet the Paris commitment, our 1.5 degree target. I think it's possible. There are certainly models. DC under the Green Building Act requires a LEED certification, which certainly isn't issued at the moment. The C of O is awarded. There's a green bond that the builder, the owner, the developer has posted, and that's not released until that certification is awarded. And if it's not awarded within 2 years of C of O, then the bond is forfeited. And so there are other examples of things that are similar to that, where there is some kind of performance period post-delivery of a building where something must be demonstrated once the building is substantially complete and the C of O is issued. So certainly whether that's some other characteristic, energy performance or something else, I think that an outcome could be anticipated. Where it can't be proven is something like fire code. We're going to rely on the model. We're not going to make the building prove that it meets fire code through an actual demonstration. So there are going to be some aspects of the performance code that are just going to be predicted and not demonstrated, hopefully ever.
Yeah, and maybe I'd jump in there real quick. I mean, there are other examples in other countries too. So New Zealand has what they call a building warrant of fitness. So any safety oriented or essential system in the building owner has to warrant every year that the systems are operational to the performance requirements, and it can be audited every 3 years. So the intent there is to get at things like fire and other systems to make sure that if you're relying on sprinklers or door closers or smoke control, that there's annual, requirement by the building owner to certify that they're in compliance and meeting the performance. So the actual test would come if there's a fire, and hopefully we don't have it, but there are mechanisms to, look at those outcomes and make sure they're achieved over time.
The current standards do have maintenance or performance maintenance requirements built into them already, as in fire protection systems are inspected on a routine basis to make sure that they're operational. Fire codes involve inspections on a routine basis to make sure that some of the life safety features of buildings are operational. The healthcare community has a huge process of re-inspection and re-inspection for their buildings in order to determine that they continue to comply with the federal standards through their funding mechanism. So there is a lot of precedent for examination on a continuing basis of the performance elements of a building that are now currently meeting only the prescriptive requirements. There's no reason that a performance code solution, or a solution that diverges from the specifics, couldn't use the same sort of measurement tools over a period of time to understand that whatever the elements are in the building are performing as expected at the time they were built.
And I would argue there's a public health component to something like a mechanical code. Like a lot of existing buildings I've gone into, outside air rates are not sufficient to meet requirements. You know, there's many things that are not as were designed and as the building's intended. I would love to see an outcome-based mechanical code. I would love to see some periodic inspections. Buildings where the dampers, the motors are no longer functioning, or they've been locked, so that outside air rates are reduced to reduce energy. But you know, we coming through this pandemic know that outside air rates are actually really critically important, not just for a pandemic, but for cold and flu and other things and human health. I think there's a lot of things that we could actually address with performance-based code and periodic verification. So I think it's, you know, and it's a jobs issue. Talking to our friend who's now in the White House, Mark Chambers, said, you know, there's some job creation element here that's actually very attractive, but it's a different kind of job sometimes than what you see in the plan reviewer or building inspector, and that's attractive actually. You don't necessarily have to have a licensed engineer if you have somebody who's doing some field inspections, or somebody who's taking performance data, building energy consumption, and reviewing that data. And so it's, you know, it opens the door for different types of jobs in communities, and that's attractive as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the part of the problems that we really run into out in the field with the performance of existing buildings is often overlooked once a building is completed. And that's a failure of simply the model codes to integrate that kind of element in the process of turning a building over to an owner for operation. A lot of owners aren't adequately educated on what their required maintenance and performance evaluations of their systems within these buildings. We see that all the time when we go into existing buildings and begin to look at how they have been bastardized, as the best term I can come up with, in different ways, without the aid or assistance of qualified individuals to help them do this. Had a client that we had done dozens of school buildings for in the early 2000s, I mean, but we went back like 2 years later, and the owner was complaining about their mechanical systems. And we went in there and we found out that they had closed all the fresh air dampers and wired them shut. They were sold by an energy efficiency company that they were going to improve their energy efficiency by doing this. It's, you know, it's sad. But back to the point.
I think one of the bigger challenges is often the turnover process is actually pretty good, but you go to a building 2 or 3 years later and the people, the individuals, even if the organization ownership of organization is the same, the people are not. Sometimes the ownership organization is not the same either. Buildings, the ownership turns over, the building engineering personnel turnover. And even if they don't, they need to be training periodically. So there's definitely some continuity issues there. I think that turnover at the moment of handing over the building to ownership, often there are some good processes in place, but it's the long-term O&M that we have challenges with, and that's why I think performance codes, could be the gateway to outcome-based codes, and I think that that's a really important thing to consider.
And maybe jumping in a little bit again, I think that's important. I think one thing we tried to do in the first edition was, put a deed restriction so the performance report would be tied as ownership changed, management changed. The effectiveness of that, of course, is limited because the code's not used, but I think implementing those ideas could happen again. One thing I'd like to explore a little bit more is, do we understand well enough how buildings are performing or what the performance expectations are? I think, some of the times, when you're dealing particularly with a 600-page prescriptive code with, thousands of pages of reference documents, it's not clear to those not involved in the design, what the building is expected to be doing, how it should perform, and how you're measuring it. And at least for me, one of the shortcomings I see in the current performance code is there's very few measurable criteria. So some of the functional objectives are laid out, but then when you have to make a decision, how do you meet them? And somebody has to verify that, things are a little bit more difficult. So as maybe it would be good to get some perspectives there, because I know that's a challenge in fire and that's came up a couple of times, and it might be in other areas as well.
I had a question about the performance code and the building maintenance code, because a lot of air leakage requirements might be fairly stringent and might be commission checked, et cetera, at the beginning of the operation of the building, and many times they quickly start to fail as building drifts and other things, open sealant joints and penetrations, and pretty soon the leakage is much worse than was originally designed. I was just wondering if that's been discussed, whether the maintenance code could somehow be enhanced.
Yeah, I think that's, again, part of the discussion. I guess partly I'm looking at this as, if you're going to set up a performance building regulatory system, the system has to work. So the performance code is one aspect, inspection, test, and maintenance is another aspect. Any, sensor and feedback, components have to be part of that. Part of the challenge also, I think, is we haven't looked at the system. Everybody works on the individual components and hope they fit together. But then, we hear about these issues and nobody goes back and kind of tightens them up. And the air leakage is not just an issue for energy performance, it impacts fire as well with smoke movement and fire ratings. And it's a big issue. And, a lot of countries have seen problems with that as we have too. So there's reasons to tie these things together. Partly, I think the first step is defining the system and what feedback loops you need to make sure you're getting the performance you expect.
Yes, I'm seeing this in 4 options. It's one thing to inspect if a damper is opening and closing or a smoke control system functions. It's a different one to look at an EUI outcome of a building. It's vastly different infrastructure and what you do. Or is it simply a retro commissioning thing that happens from time to time? Or is it an inspection like a smoke control system? I guess there's lots of pathways, and some of them are, I think an outcome EUI is one of the most challenging ones to do, because there's so many caveats and when dollars ride on the line of whether you comply or not. It's really challenging. The ASHRAE 100 methodology of requiring an energy audit is an interesting one, because that would uncover any retrocommissioning issues probably. I guess there's lots of pathways, and I was trying to list them so that we can select among them or discuss the merits of each.
Yeah, I guess for today's venue, it's more raising the issues and things that would be discussed in detail, you know, and maybe I should have clarified this earlier. My research process now is to just kind of see where we're at and what needs to be done. I would think there's a several year effort needed to go forward, you know, to, if ICC decides to develop a new performance code where all of these issues would need to be tackled. So, you know, Paul had alluded to this a little bit earlier, but, you know, the next step in the process will be a workshop in February, and it's looking like what I'm planning to do is have 2 sessions about 2 weeks apart. So there'd be a half-day session on or about the 2nd of February, which would be a half day where some of the outcomes from the roundtables and the big issues are raised. Then, you know, people would be put into breakout groups, and instead of like you would do in person, you would have a couple of weeks to, you know, work with your breakout group to tackle some of the issues and come back a couple of weeks later and present out. And then at the end of the process, when I've, you know, been able to compile all of the information from the roundtables, research, the workshop, I'd make a report to ICC and some recommendations on going forward. So the idea is to collect this information now, see where we have commonality on, you know, what the structure might be, what the challenges would be, where the gaps are, and how we might move forward to tackling them. And it's my great hope that ICC will take that and say, okay, let's really take a new kind of bottom-up start to the performance code with all this information, with all these engaged stakeholders, and develop a holistic code that addresses the issues.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're identifying the challenges today, and I will just bring up 2 right now. One is, who's doing this? Are they existing staff that are now, you know, in a lot of the jurisdictions in Washington, they are, and I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, but they're the building inspector, they're the code, they're the permit official, and they're the postmaster as well. So if they do all those roles, how are they then supposed to take on an additional role? And how do they get trained to do that? Or is it a new role that now we're hiring, you know, all, I don't know, thousands of jurisdictions in the country are now having to hire one additional full-time employee or a partial employee to do that? Or is it a third party that now every state sets up an office that manages this kind of program outside of regular permits? I guess that's one challenge, is who's doing this and how are they being trained, and how do we get from 0 to 100 in a short amount of time? Because it's, you know, if people adopt this. And then what do we do about buildings under 50,000 square feet? Because just as a semi-arbitrary line, buildings over 50,000 have facility managers that possibly even gone to college to run a building, and they know what they're doing, and they go to trainings and they do lots of things. And a majority of the buildings out there are under 50,000 square feet, and they have people running them who may not, who may be either part-time or nobody is running the building. Actually, it's the owner of the building that just goes in and hires someone to do something from time to time. And like the school district that was mentioned earlier, maybe gets bad advice from time to time as well. So I guess those are the 2 of the bigger challenges that I'll bring up.
Keel, I think that's very interesting observations. I think the design of the performance code was to put the responsibility in the hands of the design team and the owner to come up with a solution following the guidelines within the performance code. And then the code official's responsibility is to basically concur with the proposed solutions that are brought forward based on the research and data that's provided to say that that provides something equivalent to or superior to what the model codes specify as a minimum requirement. The building codes are all minimums, baselines. And we all know jurisdictions that are adopting codes that are so far behind the technology of what's happening in the industry today that we can easily design buildings to meet that minimum baseline, and typically are doing almost by fault using advanced technologies already that aren't even recognized in the codes. So how do we bridge that gap between what is the minimum adopted standard versus what is the possibility for a design solution that exceeds or satisfies, you know, exponentially, but not using the specification mode?
And I
Yes.
would say that you know, the way the model codes are set up, each jurisdiction, when they adopt the model code in the administration chapter, says what is the department that enforces, you know, that section of the model code. In terms of energy, I know like New York, the Department of Buildings enforces their benchmarking and building performance standards, local law 97, but in DC, the existing building benchmarking and performance standard is enforced by the Department of Energy and Environment. That's up to each jurisdiction, whether it's the code department or a new department, or if they want to, as we do often with code enforcement, allow for third party, you know, plan reviewers, et cetera, to allow for third party personnel or consultants to expedite or offer their services to do the same function that otherwise would be handled by a department or agency within the AHJ. So, you know, that gets described in the administration chapter when the jurisdiction adopts the model code. So I think, you know, it can be handled locally, however they want to do it, but there's plenty of models right now already in place that I think show that there's a lot of effective strategies to do that.
The model codes have in their administrative provisions a alternate means and methods process. And it basically gives the code authority the ability to examine these quote unquote alternate means and materials process for compliance to the minimum standards. A few cycles ago, it was proposed that the International Performance Code be specifically referenced in that section as a means and methods process. That was rejected by the ICC membership because the performance code was quote unquote so outdated and didn't reflect many of the modifications that have been made to the codes over the 20-year lifetime of that code, and which is very accurate, which also prompted us to say, wait a minute, we need to get in there and make sure this thing is at least up to date. And then we can also perhaps bring up the question of what elements it doesn't include any that have been advancements in the model codes over that period of time. And that's exactly what we tried to do through the last, or trying to do through this latest code change cycle, and which has prompted this study and Brian's work.
I think one of the issues that have kind of been overlooked when it comes to performance codes is the liability, and the jurisdictions are kind of hesitant to, even when you look at alternate materials and methods, they are hesitant to do something, because if something goes wrong and that deviation from the code is central to that issue, there could be liability on part of the jurisdiction. And all these jurisdictions obtain insurance, which is based on, some of that is based on what the currency of their building code is. And those jurisdictions that are using outdated building codes will probably see higher premiums, and so that's why we tend to see jurisdictions kind of updating their codes on a regular basis. when it comes to performance-based code, there is really nothing to go back on. With a prescriptive-based code, they said, well, we approved this because it met this. We have something in writing, black and white, sometimes gray, that they can fall back onto to say that, that's why we approved it. With a performance-based code, it's kind of a mutual agreement between the jurisdiction and the design team as to what the criteria is going to be for that project. And who knows what that criteria really is? Do we need to get people out of the building in 1 hour, 30 minutes, 15 minutes? What do we use as a baseline for comparison in order to measure performance? And I think you kind of alluded to that a while ago, Brian. And so one of the things that we're looking at in this upcoming code cycle for Group B is when you do modeling, your baseline is going to be based on the prescriptive code. You model the prescriptive code and then use that as the baseline for measuring we're still trying to figure out how to actually make that work, because how do you model the baseline if your design is not really meeting the prescriptive code? So it's it's still something that needs to be investigated, but there has to be some means of establishing criteria that is reasonable and measurable for the design team that both the design team and the jurisdiction feels comfortable with.
Since we're talking
I
about
think-
challenges, I thought you were going to bring up liability regarding, if we're looking at outcome-based standards and we're looking at accountability for multiple years after delivery. We know that predictive modeling and simulation normalize a lot of factors, like occupant behavior, et cetera, weather, operations and maintenance, because we don't know how those things are going to take place. And that's one of the things I just presented with my assistant chief legal counsel, a 3-part series on managing risk for architects under building performance standards for DC, because how do you manage risk in the design and delivery process? If the building owner is going to be held accountable for this building performance, they're going to be fined. And so you want to make sure that you aren't somehow, called up 7 years later because they've got a $10 million fine on their hands. So that is a challenge. I think this is still necessary, but I think we have to talk about that as a challenge.
I think another challenge is that not all jurisdictions are the same. You got, I'm temporarily located in Coeur d'Alene. That building department is totally different than any other building department, and some of them may not be able to handle. Don't have the capacity to handle, alternate means and methods. I can tell you in Hawaii, nobody adopts the mechanical code. Mechanical code is supposed to be checked by the state. But when you submit your drawings to the state, they're just checking to make sure that your outside air intake is correct and that you're providing, exhaust air in spaces that need to be exhausted. So I'm sure there's many more examples of that around the country. So we need to be able to be flexible with this, no matter what we do, because we have to make it simple. Otherwise, nobody's going to use it.
One thing that I'm wondering about, and this might be maybe a little bit off topic, but what's the cost of all of this? And I'm not talking about the cost of the building. I'm talking about, we get paid a fee to design a building. And that translates to the amount of time we take to design the building, to, from the aesthetic aspects of it, to the more concrete aspects, things that manifest themselves more in the building code. And, it feels to me like, there's a big effort here if I want to use the performance code for a building. even if I get past selling it to my local jurisdiction, you know, there's a real burden on me to prove everything I'm doing is meeting, is going to meet the criteria or meet the issues that I'm identifying that need to be identified. And, you know, as it stands right now, you grab the building code, you flip through it, you know, you want to do a stair, you know, 7-Eleven and your width and all those kinds of things, as opposed to saying, I need to move vertically through the building. How can I do that? How can I do that in a safe manner? Yeah, maybe one of the ways is a stair, but maybe there's another way I can do it. And, you know, in my frame of reference, we have a variance process in Wisconsin that, you know, would address things like the Ron's 102-foot common path issue. If you wanted to exceed that, you have the opportunity to propose an equivalent degree of design or equivalent degree of safety with another, you know, by producing a number of conditions, adding things, enhanced detection, enhanced alarm systems, enhanced sprinkler systems, those types of things to show that you're offsetting the fact that I got to go another 2 feet before I have a choice of 2 ways to go. But it, you know, it feels to me like in this case, we're basically looking at the building, the entire building as a variance. We're going to set the criteria. I mean, the framework is there in the performance code, but pretty much where we go with it is up to us. And to Bill's point about the jurisdictions being a lot different, I could see it being a very economical effort in some jurisdictions, and in others, you know, it's going to be exhaustive for you to prove that you are meeting the performance criteria. So I'm just wondering, layering that on top of it, you know, and again, understanding we get paid a fee, you know, to design the building, and that translates to an effort in hours. And, you know, are we going to be able to capture that fee or get close to it? And I understand that, you know, there's a period of time for, you know, as things get more integrated into the process. You know, the energy code was going to be, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to afford these buildings. We're not going to be able to do all of this. I remember when they instituted the energy code in Wisconsin in the middle 90s, formal codified energy code. You know, everybody was all up in arms, and state did a very good job of showing that quite a few of the buildings with few modifications would comply with the code. So look at it, don't get upset. But I'm just, you know, how much of a time of integrating the performance code into what we do is an option or will affect things.
And I think to that point of the cost, in order to do a good alternate compliance path or whatever, you need to understand all the reasons why the code was written as it was, not just some of the reasons. And so it's really easy to look at the code and say, my stair needs to be this wide and the rise and run needs to be this. But if you were to do something alternate than that, you then have to understand all the reasons why the stair was that wide, the rise and run were such and such, the landings were such and such. And then the code official, in order to review that, also has to understand all of that. So, you know, the idea of the prescriptive code is we've taken all that detailed thousands of hours of research understanding and put it into a few, well, not a few, but I wouldn't even say simple language, but put it into things that can be checked, yes or no, in many cases. And so, you know, to go beyond that, you have to really understand all the reasons why the code was written, and they're not always clear in the code why it was written a certain way. So I can see that, you know, 95% of the jurisdictions in the country probably wouldn't have the understanding to review any of that stuff competently.
I had a question about underwriters and the standard of care, because you know, a small practitioner like myself, I have to say that I'm not designing condominiums. I'm not involved in design build, that kind of thing. So if the performance code was really more widely promulgated, it seems to me that you might be under a lot more risk, design risk, because you're taking on a lot of more inventive responsibilities, and I just wonder if the underwriters and the AIA's best practice have weighed in on that.
So I might jump in here for a little bit, and I want to go around and ask others who haven't commented to see if they have some information or questions to add. I think, just in terms of looking at other countries, any country that has a performance-based building code has a prescriptive compliance option. And it's generally understood, I don't know what your estimate is, but generally understood that only about 5 to maximum 15% of buildings are largely designed using performance. Most buildings follow the prescriptive, what they call deemed to satisfy option, because you don't really need to do performance engineering of a stair or some of the other features in many buildings. A lot of countries also have a requirement for third-party peer review of performance-based design as a means to help code officials, fire officials, and others who may not have the expertise to review the analysis to help come to a decision. And some countries even have independent, private sector building surveyors or building control, so that the client has an option to either go through the governmental route or go through a third-party compliance option. And that has different sets of liabilities and responsibilities, but also different opportunities. And then, some countries, and England is looking at this, really focusing on a certain sector of buildings. So keeping energy aside for a second, really complex or high risk buildings. So if you're performance designing for fire or structure or whatever, there's really, a certain category or a certain set of risk factors that push you into the need or desirability to go performance, where the capacity is greater, to do the analysis and review. I think energy performance is a little bit different, because that should apply, to all buildings, but I think there's ways to integrate those concepts. So I think these are all good points that are being brought up. And I think there are also maybe ways we can look at how different aspects of these can be addressed based on experience in different jurisdictions in the US, but also some international experience as well. So with that, I do want to get to a few of the other people to see if there's any comments to add to the discussion or other new things to bring up. So maybe I'll jump over to Chris first.
Sure. Well, I mean, I know that jurisdictions are going to vary quite a bit over, states and within states themselves. So the acceptance and trust that is involved in going a performance route is going to vary considerably. And I think that's one of the questions that is being looked at in this modification for the 104.11 having to do with alternative means and methods, is who is actually doing these reports or these alternative approaches, and what are their qualifications, and what is the means by which they're going to be reviewed and accepted by a jurisdiction. So yes, that is going to vary considerably, I think, but the acceptance level is another factor there too, because when I've approached architects in talking about performance-based design, Initially, they get really excited about it. It's like, oh, well, this is the way we were taught, really, not worrying about the prescriptive requirements, but to just kind of come up with, solutions based on the particular design that they're working at. And then later on, they start thinking about, oh, well, there may be a liability issue involved in that as well. But I would say, having experienced, for example, the use of self-certification for projects here in Chicago, there was an initial pushback by architects to do that because of the liability issue. And then there was a counter push by clients and building owners and managers to move things along faster. And then all of a sudden, everybody was on board. And, we've seen very little in the way of bad situations coming from that. But they do happen. But I don't know that insurance companies even understand half of what's going on in this whole process, because they're underwriters. They understand how the process is supposed to work, but they're just as behind as some jurisdictions in terms of how they regulate codes. So I think that there's going to be a huge learning curve involved in this, and definitely a performance code is not going to be a standalone code. It's going to be something that is used intermittently and based on the project itself. There needs to be more pointers in the prescriptive codes to allow for that, and definitely there will be need to address some of the issues with regards to how compliance is being achieved, and what are those measurable factors that can make a jurisdiction feel comfortable with that approach. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. Mark, did you have anything you would like to add? You're on mute.
It's always that. Not really. I just a couple of things. I think it is the minimum level of performance or prescriptive codes are very important. As much as we might have aspirations to do other things, we are often, especially with private developer clients, pushed to explore sort of the minimal level that's required. On the other hand, when we're pushing to do higher levels of achievement, the performance code can allow for solutions that may make more sense than just a prescriptive or simplified trade-off kind of approach. So I think that it's an appealing way to try and get a more optimized alignment between the code and the end-to-end performance.
Thank you. Ryan, did you have any comments you wanted to add?
Just a couple. Our experience in trying to move to adopt the International Existing Building Code was surprising. There's a lot of jurisdictions that have adopted that here in the state as a permissive code, so we have tremendous institutional knowledge. But in the spirit of the discussion we've had about the amount of work it's going to take to spool up to this, it was the people in smaller offices who, once they realized we were moving towards adoption of this as a mandatory code, said, well, we don't understand how to inspect to that. That if you have what they regarded as a performance code where you can not just follow a prescriptive path, once we send someone out to the site, how do we verify that what was done was done? Obviously, we had a response to that, but I was surprised just to hear that sort of argument, because the spirit in it is we as building officials are becoming more clerks. That seemed to be what they were worried about. And that wasn't a role they were comfortable with, for obvious reasons. So I think there's a lot of education that's required. I'd remind you, in our discussion about the Blue Ribbon Panel, one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about was the need for transparency, because if you rely on building owners to be the people that select the level of performance, you're probably missing the mark. But if you have some encouragement to publish the the metrics for the building, how well it performs, how it treats the occupants, that will probably drive owners to make more informed decisions and reach higher levels of performance than we could just get them to do by putting into the code. I'm concerned about anytime we have these discussions about further fragmentation of our industry, where we have, building shell consultants and people like that, interior architects and licensing issues and all the things that accompany that. And so to address that, I guess the next point I would make is, to get to the liability concerns that Annika and Chris and others were raising, I'd like to see us offer what's basically a service contract. If you're an architect and you're attached to that project, you should be selling your services after the fact to, see the building on whatever frequency is required, the way that people who sell systems do presently. Why wouldn't we just look at the entire property as a system? And since we're the person who is responsible for coordinating that, say, if you want me to be responsible for this, if you want to meet these performance goals, and I'd like for you to enter into an agreement with us to, have some maintenance over be involved in the maintenance of the property. So hopefully that would help us address some of the liability, that they don't call us up years down the road when we haven't seen the property, don't understand how it's functioning, and try to associate liability with us. I think that would also be tremendously educational for us as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me see if Gary Dempster is there. Nope. How about Andrew Queenan? Okay. I think everybody's kind of had something to say. I don't know, Paul, if you had anything more you wanted to.
I have one thing I'm sitting here thinking about is,
Sure.
What projects is the performance code being targeted? The project type. I don't see this personally being used for a single family house unless it's a very complicated house. So we need to define the types of projects we're thinking about this would be used for. I see this used for very highly complex, complicated projects where the building code, the prescriptive code doesn't get there, get the code, wording right. So there's a lot of gray area in there. So again, going back to the Coeur d'Alene issue, Coeur d'Alene, probably won't see a performance code because they don't build anything over 4 stories, and, and so let's put this back into a little bit more perspective so that, we should have an intent, at the beginning of the code. This code is intended to do this and this only.
I agree with you, Bill. I think it's not the very simple or very small likely project. Not necessarily more complex though. I think it's to allow for innovation, to allow for alternative systems.
Sure.
And so like maybe someone's using a lot of thermal mass, and so and maybe there's ways in which they find the prescriptive path of the code isn't quite letting them get there. Maybe a lot of thermal mass and natural ventilation, I don't know, but maybe there's new materials or systems that are out there that aren't captured in the prescriptive code, and they want to use them, and they can show through a performance code that they're still achieving the same objectives and performance that the prescriptive code would provide. And I think that's the intent really. It could be a simpler path, is my point. It might be less complex, and so I think it's just to, it's the building that is, more innovative potentially, maybe more complex, maybe not, but just something that is straying from the typical path. It's not the VAV box building, and so it's to allow for that to happen, for new materials to enter the market, new systems and new ideas, and for us to be able to do that and not codify them out. So kind of like we had to rethink zoning when we realized smart growth was sort of zoned out, that we had, that we weren't allowing for mixed use development and growth in our communities. And so we had to come up with new ways of thinking about planning. I think it's just to also enable. Really.
This is a tool
Mm-hmm.
that will work for almost any scale.
Yeah.
And in our business, we found it much more important in existing buildings. in order to validate
Yeah.
their continuing innovative reuse for purposes that it was never designed for in the first place. And are we going to simply throw the building away?
Yeah.
Or are we going to find ways to make it appear to at least meet the minimum criteria that the building needs to meet for its new purpose? None of these materials were ever tested to ASTM E119. What do we do with that? We don't have a path prescribed or at least guiding us to reevaluate these things and look at them in the modern terminology and the modern technologies and the modern systems that we have, to say, you know, that wood beam is perfectly fine as a fire resistive assembly. Now the wood industry has documentation that tends to prove that, but there's nothing in the code that says it's okay. It's not prescriptively recognized. So what do you do? And I think that's part of the totality of what a performance code can help us come to a common understanding of what is necessary in order to look at a wood beam that's 100 years old.
Yeah.
That's important. I guess I'm going to change an original statement that I made, initial statement I made earlier. I think for everything but energy, what we're talking about is a great idea and can go forward with lots of challenges. But all that, I think with energy, we would need to have a very separate discussion on that, because we already have lots of things written and opportunities for alternate compliance and all that with energy. So I'd like to separate those two buckets and address them separately.
Your question is, do we need it? Do we need to change where we already are in energy?
And we need to get a lot better at energy. But
well, but the question is, maybe there are an assortment of jurisdictions who have adopted benchmarking and policies and building performance standards. They're all different. And should there be a model policy, and should that belong to a suite of model codes for jurisdictions to pull off the shelf? That's where it could be a place for this. Something that writes a model code or policy that then could very easily be enforced by the building codes department. Right now, these are being authored individually by jurisdictions, which makes it a little bit harder, and then it's not clear who enforces it or how to enforce it. They have to originate this information. So could it be helpful to have some synthesis and consistency? Could that be helpful to building owners and to the design professionals that help building owners prepare for that type of future? So, but in terms of just the design outcome, you know, just the modeling, yes, I agree with you that the building code and its performance path already does exist, and we don't necessarily need to replace that. But if we're talking about an outcome-based potentially pathway, I think that, you know, I think there's something to be said for having some consistency that's helpful for all of us, rather than making every jurisdiction write their own path and all of us live with that.
Yeah, I think there needs to be an above code for energy.
So I want to jump in with a couple of questions before we end, because I don't want to keep you longer than I asked you. But one is, you know, this issue of, you know, does anybody disagree with the statement that the performance code should have in it performance metrics that you have to demonstrate you meet at the time of the design? So put aside the outcome in the future, but just for the design phase, should the code have performance metrics or not?
I would say yes.
Yes.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think there's pretty universal agreement on that. And, you know, that's one thing that the performance code now is missing is those metrics. You know, another, you know, kind of related question that we've talked around is, in your opinion, do you see the performance code as kind of the top level overarching document that tells you the performance you should achieve, and the existing, IBC and other prescriptive, or call them prescriptive means, are one way to comply? Or do you really see the performance code as a guide for an alternative approach to the prescriptive? Because I think you get two different perceptions, implementation, and outcomes depending on how that goes.
Well, the way you mentioned the former, that's the British method. I could see some validity in that, but I think there needs to be an alternative path that is more performance-based. And I don't see the prescriptive code going away. I think that has a purpose, but I would like to see an alternative path that somebody could follow other than going the prescriptive. And the prescriptive can be used for parts and pieces of a building, and then they can use the performance aspects where they feel that they need to kind of deviate from the prescriptive requirements.
Brian, the I think thought when the performance code was originally put together was that it become a very important tool for designers to use in evaluating the project's particulars, its needs, its demands, its fit within the prescriptive path, or its lack of fit within the prescriptive path, and to find opportunities to resolve those questions that would normally come up when doing that. The fact that the prescriptive criteria in the codes has evolved dramatically over the last 20 years, and the performance code hasn't moved at all. We need to re-examine its value in the system as it exists today. And I think what you're getting pretty unanimously from what I've read of the surveys that you performed and from the discussion today, that it is an important tool, that we need to bring it into the forefront of the codes. How it integrates with the prescriptive criteria is probably something we have to do in order to convince the industry, the codes development industry, to do it. And I guess that's one of the questions that I have sort of back to you from those of us in the architectural industry is, how do you see advancing this? One of the ideas that we discussed was having a code development committee that's specifically required or specifically charged with responsibility for advancing that code in a consistent way through the ICC process. Do you see something different coming out of this at this point, or do you think that we're still on the path to finding an answer to where this goes?
I don't presume to know what ICC would decide, but my recommendation would be that this needs to be its own, code development effort, because I think in my kind of ideal perspective, the performance code really should be a document that holistically looks at how a building performs and then embodies the criteria upon which you would evaluate that performance. And one means to comply would be following the IBC or the IRC or whatever. But the challenge we have now is that, Ron and others have mentioned fire, 100 feet, 102 feet, 30 feet, 35 feet. What is the real performance objective? It's not the length of a dead end or the width of a stair, or even how a particular structural system performs in a standard fire test. Is it about getting people out? Is it about keeping the building, stable during firefighting operations? What is it? If we can't define the performance in a way to measure it, you can't use the existing code to benchmark because it's not going to tell you anything. So my bias, which I'm trying to leave out of this to a great extent, is that, we have to tackle the big issues of what is the performance we want out of the building, how do we describe it, and how can we verify it? And then we can go forward. If we're not willing to tackle that, then we're not going to achieve, I think, what a lot of people would like to achieve.
Well, you're fortunately or unfortunately the focal point of all this effort at the moment. So I think that's why we're asking to have a bit of an understanding of what that means. And I agree with you on what you're talking about. It's the matter of how do we structure this and how do we sell this back to ICC, I guess, is the main question.
Yeah, and I think I think a big opportunity will be the workshop coming up in February, especially if just the participants of the roundtable discussions come together. It'll be over 100 people representing a pretty broad spectrum of the community. And of course, I'll take hits because I can't get to everyone. But if a group of 100 or 120 people can come together and say, look, this is where we think we need to go and what's needed, I think ICC will listen to that a lot more than just me saying, this seems to be the right approach. And my sense is that, from talking to all the groups I have so far, there's pretty good agreement that this is the type of direction that we need to go in. And, I'd like to get to the point where we can have that, excuse me, discussion in the workshop and come out with that and, go in that direction. And I guess with that, I would, ask before, because time is just about up, is everybody here, would you be willing to participate in the workshop, if time is available, and also to maybe participate in another discussion to try to further some of these issues a little bit more, of course, time permitting.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'd love to participate.
Yes.
Great. So I'll definitely keep everybody on the list, and to let you know what the plan forward is over the next couple of weeks, I'll summarize notes from this meeting. I'll set up a Dropbox site where I'll upload the recording, my summary notes, because basically I'm going to try to capture the main issues and some of the details, but not a verbatim. And ultimately the recording will be posted with the summaries, and the summaries will go into the report. So all of this will help to feed into what's going forward. And the idea is that, when we announce the workshop either later this month or very early January, all the roundtable recordings will be up, the summaries will be up, and people from different disciplines at least will have the opportunity to hear the perspectives of the different groups in advance of the workshop, which hopefully will make a more robust and focused discussion. So that's where we're at the moment. And I really appreciate all the input and expertise that you bring to this problem.
Brian, thank you for including us in this. I think it's extremely valuable and productive. And I think Ron Garan and his group have done a great job of sort of lighting the fire under the question of what do we do with a performance code and how do we make it work better for all of us from the design point of view and code enforcement point of view and building point of view.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Paul, for
Thank
helping
you.
facilitate this. And I look forward to further discussions with everyone.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.